Let me know. We're good? All right. Good evening. On a beautiful spring day. It was almost warm, a little windy, but anyhow, it was nice. It beats the rain. So I spent some time working outside this afternoon. I hope you got outside and enjoyed the good weather. Here we are for week 2 of the sin problem, not the way it's supposed to be. And tonight we're going to talk about the sin that surrounds us. We live in a world, and always have, where there has always been and always will be, as it's currently constituted, sin. So I want to look at some passages. I hope you have your Bible in front of you. Turn to Genesis chapter 3. See, the problem is that this situation with sin present is not normal. It is not what God intended. It is abnormal. It's just that we've never known anything else. I was thinking this week what it must have been like for Adam and Eve, who experienced the before and the after. They knew the difference. We've only ever seen this. And in a subsequent session, we'll talk about whether sin is getting worse. Is there more of it now than there was 100 years ago or 1,000 years? We'll talk about that. But the point is, it's all around us, and to us, it looks like the normal. And it's not. It is not what God intended. It is not the way it's supposed to be. So, Genesis chapter 3, let's start reading at verse 16. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. We accept that as just normal. It is the way it is. It wasn't supposed to be that way. What would it be like if women didn't have pain in childbirth? If they said, honey, I think it's time. Oh, look at that. Here's a baby. It doesn't work like that, does it? And we don't expect it to. Most of you probably know that for several years, Pam and I raised goats. And they bore kids. I don't know how many, 2 dozen kids we had born while we had goats. And it's hard. I was curious to see if the goats went through the kind of labor that a woman goes through. And I think the answer is no. It's sometimes hard to tell because they don't scream at you. But anyhow, it would be interesting to see what it was like for Eve before this. Then it says, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. There is some difficulty understanding that verse because it uses some Hebrew expressions that we're not sure. Your desire shall be for your husband. That word desire is the word that is used of a lion who pursues its prey. So it is pursuing. But then it says, and he shall rule over you. And one option, one way to understand that is that the woman so wants to be married and pursues a man, and then when she gets him, she finds out he's a tyrant. He's a jerk. She married a guy that mistreats her. What she thought she wanted so badly becomes a curse, as it were. And then he says to Adam, because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. For us, weeds and all of the problems associated with the earth are normal. It was not intended to be that way. And again, I was thinking about this week because I sprayed, we have 3 acres, and about maybe half to 3/4 of an acre is planted in fruit trees, and all around the fruit trees is weeds, and I've decided that doesn't look very good. So I've sprayed to kill the weeds, and I will plant pasture grass there. And I was thinking about this. I wrestle with those weeds, and I'm going to have to spray again because I can see they didn't all get sprayed or something went wrong because they're not all dying. Pam has a large vegetable garden that she will plant in another week or so. And she'll go out every day and weed her garden and tend it. And that's not what God wanted. He wanted us to go out and just harvest. It was going to be automatic. This has become the normal for us, and that's the problem. Genesis chapter 4, verse 8. You know this story. Cain kills his brother Abel. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. That is more tragic than we realize reading the verse. It's too easy to read that verse and miss the horrible evil that it is. Somebody said, one person's death is a tragedy, 1,000 people dead is a statistic. This is the first death. And I was thinking as I read that earlier about Adam and Eve. It is, from my experience, years as a pastor, the most difficult thing anybody ever goes through when they have a child that dies. It is so traumatic. We don't expect our children to die before us. I watched my parents when my older sister died. I watched them grieve so deeply, even though there was the faith that sustained them. Then to know that one of your children killed the other must have been especially horrible for them. And now we read every day in the news about murders, about deaths. We read about genocide, the Uyghurs in Western China. We read about Africa, where there are nations that have been at civil war. Syria, horrible situations. And they have become, sadly, the norm for us. And they don't strike us like they should. The word disease is an interesting one. And you see that I've hyphenated it. God created the earth and everything in it, shalom. We talked about that last week. He intended shalom, peace and harmony and integration and everything working in relationship with everything else. Shalom is creation at ease, at peace. And because of sin, we have dis-ease. We have disease, to be sure, but we have this tension, this turmoil, this mess at every level of the physical creation and the human creation and their relationships with each other. And so, as you can see, I've titled this slide, The Peddler of Evil. And by that, I refer to the devil, to Satan, to our enemy, our great enemy. We're not going to spend time discussing where he came. Well, he was the archangel. He was the number one angel. He was Lucifer, the Bible tells us. And then he rebelled. The Bible gives us very, very little information about that. There is a passage in Isaiah and there's a passage in Ezekiel, both of which may refer to that, but even those passages are open for discussion in terms of exactly what's going on. But there's no question about Ephesians chapter 6. Let's go there and read, because this is at the same time both a familiar passage and one that may say things that you haven't noticed before. Ephesians chapter 6. This is the armor of God passage. Ephesians chapter 6, let's read from verses 10 to 12. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. He says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We do, but the real battle, the source, the cause of that struggle we have with our fellow man is the devil, who it says here has schemes. He plans, he plots against us. There are two extremes. One is, and perhaps you've known Christians who get so obsessed with the devil that they see Satan behind everything that goes wrong. I was in an accident today. The devil put me in an accident. No, he didn't. Accidents happen. But the other error that is equally as problematic is to ignore that Satan is at work. And we can't see him, but he is certainly at work. And what's interesting here is we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against, and look at these nouns, plural, rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, spiritual forces in the heavenly places. In the Greek, those are words that are military terms. They're not unlike if I were to say lieutenants and admirals and generals, and I purposely chose from Army and Navy. If we talked about rank, these are Greek words that refer to rank in an army. If you haven't read C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, you really need to do that. It's easy reading. It's enjoyable reading. It is fiction. But what C.S. Lewis does in that book, it's a series of letters between, I'll call him a demon, named Screwtape, and his supervisor. And I don't, if I remember correctly, it's been a long time, but I don't think the supervisor has a name. He may, but the underling is Screwtape. And Screwtape has been assigned to an individual to keep him from God, and then when he gets saved, to drive him as far from God as possible. And Screwtape is sort of new at all of this. And so he has this correspondence. Screwtape letters are the correspondence, fictional, that he has with his supervisor, and his supervisor giving him advice about how to cause trouble for this individual, this believer. And that ranking, that hierarchy, is exactly what this passage suggests. There's a passage in the book of Daniel where the angel comes to Daniel and says, I have a message for you. I would have been here sooner, but I was hindered by. And Paul, and then he mentions one of Satan's workers. Paul says there was given to him a messenger from Satan who oppressed him and gave him a physical ailment, a thorn in the flesh, from a messenger of Satan. So Satan, if we understand some of these passages, Isaiah and Ezekiel, and then there's one in Revelation, if we understand them correctly, when Satan rebelled, he took 1/3 of the angels with him. Angels are created beings that don't procreate. There's a fixed number of them. And that when Satan rebelled, he led 1/3 of them with him. And this passage suggests that they are organized in a hierarchy and have assignments. The passage in Daniel suggests that some are assigned to governments. It may be then that some are assigned to national governments and some to local governments, and are some assigned to individuals? We don't have any information on that in the Bible. It's interesting it's something to consider, and we're going to come back to that in another context tonight. But it's naive and dangerous to not factor into our view of what's going on the fact that there is a devil, that Satan is active in opposing God and all that he does. So turn to 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Humble yourselves, verse 8, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. And then the punchline, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. There is an intensity and a ferocity and a danger to Satan and his work. And, okay, Satan is not God. He doesn't have the attributes of God. He is not omniscient. He is not omnipresent. He is not omnipotent. He's limited. He is supernatural. Let's be careful with our use of words here. Supernatural doesn't just mean God. It means more powerful than we are. Superman. Okay? So Satan is supernatural. He's not God, but he is more powerful than we are, and he is active, and he has his army. If we can go back to Ephesians 6 and use that word for the rankings, he has an army that works for him on his behalf. And be sober-minded and watchful, because the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Yeah. Which of those two extremes have you been more inclined to? Seeing the devil behind every misadventure, or ignoring the reality of an active devil who opposes what God is doing? 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Maybe you can tell me what this verse means, because I've wondered about it, and I'm not sure I've come to a settled opinion on it. I'm in 2 Corinthians, excuse me. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. Again, it's probably a familiar verse for you. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but will, with the temptation, also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. I'm especially interested in that first sentence. Paul says to the Corinthian Christians, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. If you know anything about the Corinthian Christians, they were a hot mess. Their church there were lawsuits, there was drunkenness, there was sexual misbehavior in the church that was tolerated and sort of winked at by. It was a horrible mess. And yet, Paul says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. That expression, not common to man, means ordinary. Nothing really in the extreme, just sort of the ordinary stuff, the common, everyday stuff. You folks in that church are so messed up in so many areas, and yet you haven't had any particular temptation. It's not like he came at you with both guns blaring. You've just had to deal with the ordinary stuff. That suggests that there is extraordinary temptation. So now, let me ask you, can you give me a biblical example of someone who came under extraordinary temptation from the devil to do evil? Because there are some standout cases.
Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane?
Absolutely. Both in the desert at the end and in the Garden of Gethsemane. Absolutely. The particular focused oppression of the devil himself. Okay? How about an Old Testament example? Can you think of an Old Testament example? Okay, I'm going to give you...
When he was in the cave with Saul.
Now, certainly he was tempted and resisted that temptation, but I'm thinking about someone who Satan, we know, went after particularly. Job. Yeah. He went to God and said, can I have at him? And God said yes. So Job got the focused attention of the devil himself. Okay? I think we can probably put Paul in there as well, because he says a messenger from Satan. He was singled out. Why did God single out Job? Why did Satan single out Job? Because he wanted to make an example of him. Because Job was extremely righteous, and if Satan could pull Job's feet out from underneath him, he'd have a real prize. Why did Satan attack Jesus particularly? Well, for obvious reasons, to get him to sin. Why did Satan attack Paul so specifically and in such a focused way, same thing. If he can ruin Paul, look what happens or doesn't happen with the spread of the gospel. So those are three biblical examples of extraordinary temptation. Here, Paul is telling them, you guys didn't have to mess with any of that. You just, the ordinary stuff that comes along, and you folded, you buckled and got into such messes as a congregation. So the question is, have you ever come under extraordinary temptation? I haven't. I don't need that kind of attention to get me to sin. He didn't have to work that hard with me. I'm my own worst enemy. He doesn't have to come after me, for Pete's sake. I'm going to do it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what we've read is that Satan, that the devil opposes all that God is doing, that he has those who work for him that work with him in that opposition, that he seeks to devour those who would follow and serve God, and we're foolish to ignore that and to not take account of it. And so, here's one for you. See, we don't have answers to a lot of this, but COVID, there's no question that COVID has hurt the church. Not just UFC, but churches all across the country. In some states more than others. Is that something that makes the devil grin, or is that something that he had a part in causing? Was that something that pleased him, or was he a causative factor? And we don't know. We certainly can't answer that for sure. But when I say it would be foolish to ignore that Satan is active and involved, it's worth considering, at least. We can't answer it, so let's not go off half-cocked, but it's worth keeping that in mind. So what we've got is a polluted environment. It is polluted because there is this peddler of evil that is active. He is active and goes about like the roaring, Peter says. Okay, it's polluted because of his influence, but it is also polluted, we started out in Genesis 3. Because of your sin, we will have dis-ease in childbirth, in thorns and thistles and weeds and the rest of it, and animals eating up animals and all of the rest of it, the death, so that already we've got two sources of this evil. One is the active work of the devil and his minions, and the other is the environmental effects of Adam and Eve's sin. So, I put this verse on a slide. There is so much here. For all that is in the world, I'll tell you what, go ahead. Please turn to 1 John 2. I know it's on the slide, but you go ahead because I'm going to have you mark up this verse with your pen. True spiritual Christians, really devoted to God, have four-colored pens. That's just the way it is. That's one of the ways you can tell someone who is truly walking with the Lord is they have a four-colored pen that they use when they study the Bible. Okay, for all that is in the world, put a little number 1 and circle it by the desires of the flesh. So next to that first, the desires, put a little number 1 and circle it. The desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, put a little number 2 there. And if you had a four-color pen, you could use a different color. I'm just saying. The desire of the eyes. And then put a number 3 with yet a third color, with the pride of life. 3 things are mentioned. For all that is in the world, and think of that Genesis 3 world that is corrupted by sin. Even if for a day we could get the devil to go on vacation, we'd still have these problems because we'd be in the world. The desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the third one, the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world, from our corrupted world. Okay, now watch. Nothing up my sleeve. Turn to Genesis chapter 3. Go back to where we started. Genesis chapter 3. Because we're going to write more numbers in this verse. And if you did it in colors, we're going to use the same colors. I'm going to leave that slide up there so that you have ready reference because you've left 1 John and you're now in Genesis chapter 3, and I want you to look at verse 6. Genesis 3:6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Okay, Mrs. Adam, first name Eve, looked at that fruit and saw three things. What were the three things she saw? That it was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. Okay? The first one is good for food. Is that the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, or the pride of life? Which is it? Desires of the flesh, good for food. Oh, do you like good food? I like good food. I'm partial to dessert. Well, dessert and bacon, especially bacon, but desserts. I have an apple turnover sitting on the counter at home. And when I get home, I'm going to make myself a cup of coffee and have that apple turnover. And I'm only going to have one because that's all that's left because I've eaten all the others. There's something about good food. Yeah. She saw that it was good, and then she saw that it was a delight to the eyes. Well, that's pretty easy, isn't it? We got the desire of the eyes. And then it was to be desired to make one wise, the pride of life. So what we saw in John 2:16, we see in Genesis 3:6. I don't think that's coincidence at all. I think you can take any sin, or the temptation thereof, and put it in one or more of those three categories. In the case of the fruit, it fit all three. Where is your soft spot? I have way too many of them. But one of them is cars. I just like cars. Always have. Since I was a kid, I've been into cars. And for a lot of my adult life, maybe most of it, I've restored old cars. I have a lot of fun doing that. It's sort of a hobby. I'm not particularly good at it, but I'm good enough that I do okay. And after I've finished restoring a car, I drive it for a few months and have some fun with it. And then I sell it, hopefully for a profit, and get another one. Start over again. I've had some really cool cars. And I've often thought, which of all of the cars, probably 2 or 3 dozen, which one would I most like to have back? And I think it would be my 59 Oldsmobile. It was a 2-door hardtop. It was as long as this room is wide. It was white. And if you know anything about cars in the late 50s, it had chrome everywhere. I paid $1 for it because I bought it from a lady in the church who had inherited it, and she didn't want it. It was way too big for her. It's too big for everybody, for Pete's sake. You could park another car in the trunk. But I literally had people follow me around waiting for me to stop so they could buy the car. And I wouldn't sell it to them, but this thing was a head turner. People loved that, and I loved driving it. Why did I like driving it? Which of those three was it? Was it the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, or the pride of life? For me, it was the lust of the eyes because it was a beautiful car. But it was also the lust of the flesh because I had people saying, oh, man, that's a beautiful car. Well, and I'm driving down we had this car in Southern California. which is all about cars. And I'm driving down, people honking and waving and giving me thumbs up, and I'm thinking, dude, I'm cool. I am driving this 59. Now listen, the thing, it's 0 to 60 in 3 days. It was just so heavy. And it had a huge engine that sucked gas like nobody's business. But I tell you what, man, once you got that thing up to 70 miles an hour, it was like sitting in your living room couch. You couldn't feel a thing. It was just wonderful. It had a speedometer, the coolest speedometer in the world. The speedometer was a bar that went across like this, and the numbers were up here. And the further across it went, it changed colors. So it was like a green bar up until about 50 or 60 miles an hour, and then it changed to a yellow bar, and then at 80 it changed to a red bar. It was just a cool car, and everybody loved my car, and so that was pride of life. So I had lust of the eyes, my eyes, and the pride of life, their admiration of it. Okay, so I want you to think of your soft spot, or one of your soft spots, and I want you to think, which of these category or categories plural does it fit into? Because all temptation falls into one of these categories. It's the world. See, there's Satan, and he's active. We shouldn't be naive and ignore that. But we live in a world that is polluted by sin. Okay, we're not done. There's more. Trust me. Go to Hebrews chapter 4. I'm chasing you back and forth a little bit, but that's what we got to do, because there's good stuff to be found. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15. Speaking about Jesus, he says, we do not have a high priest, that's Jesus, who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect was tempted as we are, yet without sin. He says Jesus was tempted in every way, just like we are. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's not true. First of all, he never had kids. He never had a little brat running around the house testing his patience. And, I can think of all kinds of examples where he wasn't tempted like I am. Okay, watch. Again, nothing up my sleeve. Turn to Matthew chapter 4. Do you know what we're going to find in Matthew chapter 4? Can you guess? We are going to find the temptation of Christ. Matthew chapter 4, verse 1. And I want you to get out your pen and write the numbers 1, 2, and 3 again, in the appropriate colors if you used colors. And I'm just going to read this, and you'll realize right away what's going on. Matthew chapter 4, verse 1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil direct. And after fasting 40 days, I can't go 40 hours. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. Which is that? Which of the three categories is that? Lust of the flesh. And so that's number one. So you should put a number one in the circle there. Verse 5. Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Which is that? Yeah. Not as obvious. Throw yourself off the highest point on the temple, and the angels will catch you, lest you bump your foot. Okay, tell you what, we'll leave that one in suspension, and we'll go on. Verse 8, again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Which is that? Lust of the eyes. He showed him all the glories of the world and its splendor, and said, you can have all of this beauty if you will just worship me. So that the angels catching him is what? the pride of life. You are so important that you won't even bruise your foot because all of the angels will come to catch you. So here we have, in Matthew's order, we have 1, 3, and 2. They're listed in a slightly different order in Luke because the order isn't important. But what did the writer of Hebrews mean when he said that Jesus was tempted in every way just like we are? In each of the 3 ways. All of our temptations fall into one or more, and Christ's temptation, those same 3 categories. Yeah. So we live in a polluted world. But my biggest problem, Craig's biggest problem, is not oppression from Satan or his minions. It is not even what's in the world. It's Craig. It's that guy in the mirror. Turn to Romans 7. And as long as y'all are giving me answers to all the Bible questions, you can give me an answer to Romans 7. We're just going to read the center section of this chapter. We're going to begin at verse 14. There, verse 14. Paul said, this is autobiographical. He's speaking about himself. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not the good that I want, but the evil I do not want. It's what I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law, like the law of gravity. I find it to be a sure thing that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And which of us cannot identify with Paul's struggle, huh? I don't need Satan and I don't need the world. I am my own worst enemy. And I've got nobody to blame but myself for most of my trouble. It comes from within me. Paul's autobiographical section here is a cry of total frustration. I hate myself. I know what's right, and I want to do it, and then I don't do it. And I don't want to do what's wrong, and what is going on with me? Okay, here's the problem. The commentators cannot decide, is Paul talking about his pre-conversion life or his post-conversion life? Is he describing what his life was like before he got saved or after? You think it's after? You think it's after? Okay. I can certainly, as a child of God, I can certainly identify with this struggle. I feel it. I've been there. The argument against that is some of the things he says when he says, I know that nothing good, verse 18, nothing good dwells in me that is in my flesh. And he talks about himself as a slave to sin. That does not sound like a believer. Okay, the question here is, does the child of God have one nature or two? Back when cartoons were cartoons, they're not cartoons anymore. Do you remember being a kid, some of you? And on Saturday mornings, you watched cartoons all morning, and they were basically animated line drawings, and they were fun. And then you got Bugs Bunny and and you got Wile E. Coyote, and they were full of violence, and we all turned into axe murderers because we watched violence in cartoons. But one of the cartoons, one of the frequent images in cartoons is the character with a demon on one side and an angel on the other shoulder. And they're each whispering in his ear and each trying to persuade him to do evil or good. And he has to decide, is he going to listen to the demon or is he going to listen to the angel? Does the Christian have within himself two natures? Does he have the old nature, inclined to sin, and a new nature, inclined to righteousness? There are a couple of problems with that. One of the problems with having two natures is that by definition, natures are determinative. Do you remember last week I talked about my dog Samson, whose nature it was to wag his tail? He couldn't help but wag his tail. That dog's nature was determinative. You could not train that out of him. The sin nature is determinative. The unsaved person, the person outside of a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, has an old nature that they were born with. Do you remember we talked last week about original sin? The sin in which we were conceived. David said, "In sin did my mother conceive me." We originated in sin. We had one nature, and that was a nature inclined to sin. It doesn't mean that everything we did was sin. But if sin said, "Wag your tail, Buster," I wagged my tail, because that sin nature is determinative. Then how can I have a nature that is determinative to sin and a nature that is determinative to righteousness, that commands that I obey God? So, let's look at a couple passages that may help us out. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians, and this is going to be familiar to many of you, chapter 5, verse 17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. Does that sound like one nature or two? Sounds like one, doesn't it? That the old nature is gone. All things have become new. And as long as we're at it, turn just a few more pages to Galatians chapter 2. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. Which says, I have been crucified with Christ. Christ was put to death on the cross. I have been crucified with Christ. What was put to death in me? The old nature. It's been crucified. I was crucified. My old nature was crucified with Christ, which is why after that autobiographical sketch in Romans 7, he says, "O wretched man that I am." And then the next verse he says, "But thanks be to God who has," and then he goes on to describe the salvation. And so I think there is, even within that Romans context, reason to think that he is looking back to his pre-conversion life and describing what it was like to be a slave to his sin nature, his determinative sin nature. And then to say, "But thanks be to God, I've moved away, and all things have become new." Okay, well, wait a minute. If all things have become new, and if I don't have a determinative nature to sin, where does this sin come from within me? And the answer is the flesh. Now, the Greek word for flesh is sarx. It's spelled differently because the Greek alphabet has different letters, but it's pronounced like that, S-A-R-X, sarx. That is one of two words for the physical body. And so if you read about flesh and blood, the flesh in the Greek there is sarx. We are flesh and blood. We are sarx and, that's terrible, I forget the Greek word for blood now. I should know that. I mean, it should be right there. So it's used different ways. But one of the ways the Greek word for sarx is used is to describe this flesh part of me that is polluted by sin. Okay, one of these days, I'm going to die. And unless the Lord comes and snags us before that, and that would be fine with me. If He wanted to do that tonight, I'd be okay with that. But I'm going to get a resurrection body. One way or another, I'm going to get a resurrection body. Is that body going to be like this one? No. It will be a flesh and blood body, just as Christ in His resurrection, He said to Thomas, here, come, touch, see, I've got a body just like you. It's just that His was resurrection body without sin. And so let's look at some of that. Galatians 1:16. We're in Galatians. Look at chapter 1, verse 16. Jesus was pleased to reveal His Son to me in order that I might preach Him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before. Oh, phooey. Oh, phooey. Okay, I'm reading it in the ESV, and I don't remember what version of my Bible I was using when I put this in here. He says, I did not consult with flesh and blood. Is it King James? Is that King James? Okay, I think that's also the RSV, but I'm not sure. And so there's an example of flesh just being used to describe the physical body with no moral overtones whatsoever. Chapter 2, verse 16. Where's 6? There's 15. 16. 2:16. Yet we know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Jesus Christ in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, but because by the works of the law no one or no flesh will be justified in His sight. Okay, so there's another one where it just refers to us, who we are. We could look at some more, but tell you what, let's do for the sake of time. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15. Verse 42. 1 Corinthians 15, the resurrection chapter, verse 42. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, this body. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. And so at the resurrection, I'm getting rid of this sarx, which is perishable, which is corrupt, which is dishonorable, which is weak, and I'm going to get a new body. And so what is the location? What is the location of my sin and my sin problem? It is not an old nature. All things have passed away. Old things have passed away. All things have become new. It is my flesh. And this flesh is corrupted by sin. Now, it's using the word flesh here in a metaphorical sense. Not this, not this. But this physical body, who I am, is corrupted by sin. And I'm never going to be rid of that until I get my resurrection body. And then it's gone. And that's one of the reasons we look forward to the resurrection, he says, because we'll be rid of that. So maybe you've noticed that thus far tonight we have talked about 3 sources for sin. We started talking about our polluted world, sin-polluted world. The first source is Satan and his minions. The second source is the world and all that is within it. And under that we have the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And the third is me and my sarx, my flesh, that gives me grief. And of the three, I know which one gives me the most grief. And I look forward to the resurrection. I look forward to Revelation 22. Because the devil is going to be gone. And the world is going to be remade. And I'm going to have my resurrection body, and sin will be absent. I look forward to all of that, but right now the bottom line is I've got a sin problem. I wrestle with sin. I've been doing that for 70 years, and I'm sick of it. When I was young, a year or two ago, it didn't bother me. I tell you what, there are some mornings I get up and I think, I'm tired of this. I got to fight it all over again today. And the problem is, I know that most days I screw it up and I get it wrong. I get it wrong because I do things I shouldn't do, or don't do things I should do. I get it wrong because I say things I shouldn't say, or don't say things I should say. I get it wrong because I think things I shouldn't think, or don't think things I should think. And I'm sick and tired of the battle. Mostly I'm sick and tired of losing the battle. That's what bugs me, is when I lose it. And so how does it manifest itself, and then what can I do about it? So I think next week, that last part, what can I do about it and what should I do about it, suggests that our next topic is going to be fighting back against the sarks and against the world and against Satan. I think maybe we should do that next week, but we're not going to, because there's something else I want to do. I want to talk about the relative sinfulness of sin. Are some sins worse than others, or are all sins equal? And the answer is yes. And so we're going to look into that next week and see why some sins are worse than others, if in fact they are, and why all sins are equal. So that's what we'll do next week. Father, help us to hate sin more and be more bothered by it so that we fight against it more. And so we leave here and go out into the world, and the world is a corrupted place. And what is normal is not normal at all. It's not at all what you intended. But the bigger problem is that we go out there. We're the ones that get ourselves into trouble. Help us to hate sin enough to wage the constant battle, to be alert for the devil and for the world and for ourselves and our own weaknesses. Thank you for the word of God, Father. In our Savior's name, amen.